This is episode 413 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I am Emily Ison, Townhouse Steward at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When we imagine William Shakespeare, we often picture the playwright at his desk or standing in a London playhouse. But before any of that, he was a child. A boy growing up in Stratford-upon-Avon, surrounded by siblings, neighbors, household noise, and the everyday rhythms of family life in Tudor England. So what exactly did play look like for children in Shakespeare's world? What toys were kept in little hands? What games filled courtyards and streets? And how did ideas about childhood shape the way young people learned, imagined, and even just passed the time? Today, we're exploring this intricate world of games and playthings of Tudor children, not as a curiosity on the sidelines of history, but as part of the cultural landscape Shakespeare himself would have known. From homemade toys and rattles for infants to outdoor games and imaginative play, these experiences formed the backdrop of early modern childhood, and they surface again and again in Shakespeare's language and imagery. To guide us through this world of early modern playtime, I am joined by public historian Dr. Julia Martins, whose research into everyday life in Tudor England brings us closer to what childhood actually felt like for Shakespeare's lifetime. So let's dive in and step back into the playrooms, streets, and gardens of 16th century England and discover how Tudor children played. Julia Martins is a public historian specializing in early modern European history. Her research focuses on cultural history and everyday life, especially the history of gender and medicine. Julia has studied in Brazil, France, Italy, and England, and holds a PhD in history from King's College London. Julia has a YouTube channel and a blog about life in the past called Living History by Julia Martins. She combines her work as a historian with activism and volunteering, and she's the organizer of a feminist book club called My Body, My Book Club, which raises funds for important causes each month. You can find more about Julia on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Julia Martins History. Hello, Julia. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello, Cassidy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Shakespeare uses the word toy over 30 times in his works to describe various kinds of playthings. But what was this word in the 16th century? Was this a fairly new word to the English lexicon, and was it specifically associated with children?
That's a great question to get us started. Thank you. So the word toy probably comes from Middle English, but it takes a while for it to become sort of common parlance. In the 16th century, it means many different things, including sort of more abstract concepts like pranks or stunts, fun or frivolous things. And gradually it's increasingly connected to children. And the word starts to mean objects for play. But in Shakespeare's case, and in the many instances he uses the word toy, whether as a noun or a verb, it's usually not to do with a literal object. So, for instance, I'm thinking of Macbeth. And after King Duncan's murder, Macbeth says, "All is but toys. Renown and grace is dead." So he's talking about all is vain and frivolous and meaningless, right? Because of the king's death. So in this case, I think this is a good example to see sort of the more abstract meaning of toy, meaning something that is just about frivolity. So even when Shakespeare is referring to objects, such as in The Winter's Tale, when Autolycus is selling toys, that probably means cheap, sort of frivolous knickknacks, but not necessarily meant for children, right? So there are plenty more examples, but you get the idea. It's about fun and frivolity.
Julia writes that some toys for children were homemade or based heavily in pretend. Julia, what are some examples of toys children would have made for themselves in Shakespeare's lifetime?
I think that to get an idea of what everyday toys looked like, it's helpful to look to archaeology as well as what people at the time, usually adults, were writing about children, right? In excavations in London, and the Museum of London it's a brilliant place to learn about that. Archaeologists found wooden toys such as hobby horses, dolls, bowls, so things for kind of a pretend kitchen, carved animals, and wooden tops, for instance, right? And all these toys, they could be made at home by children themselves or by the adults around them, parents, servants, or maybe a professional toy maker, right? If we're thinking of materials, so besides wooden toys, toys made of textiles were very common, right? So things like rag dolls or puppets, as they were called, a cloth stuffed with rags and stitched faces. And I think if we're thinking of Shakespeare, the best example of that kind of toy, puppet or poppet, a doll, is in A Midsummer Night's Dream when Hermia is called a puppet. So she's compared to a doll, which hints at how common these objects were. And if we're thinking of metal, which have survived really well, right, in archaeology, miniature versions of sort of household objects like tiny pewter plates and cups, they have been found everywhere along the river, plus things such as toy soldiers or miniature weapons, those existed as well. And if we're thinking, besides archaeology, thinking of contemporary sources, there is a book that I find really interesting about this period called The Anatomy of Abuses, which was published in 1583 by Philip Stubbs. And he was a Puritan, he was a moralist, and he was essentially writing a lot about the world of children because he basically thought people were having just way too much fun. And besides thinking of adults, of course, besides sex and food and drink, he writes about games and playing. He criticizes boys who played at bucklers, meaning that they pretended to be warriors. And we know that after the Reformation, many people, many moralists were discussing this issue. So they were discussing the issue of playing and games. So in this case, Stubbs wrote that games, pastimes, and playing essentially distracted young people from their duties. And he mentions things like ball games, the dolls, cards, etc. So this is a kind of interesting source, I think, to learn more about everyday life in the Tudor era, because Stubbs was criticizing the world around him, but to do so, he's describing it, right? And that's incredibly helpful to historians. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Who knew complaining was going to be so useful to the historical record?
Yeah, I know.
Shakespeare mentions rattles in The Merry Wives of Windsor when Mistress Page talks about her young son playing with a rattle in his hand. Were babies often given rattles to play with?
Oh, yes, definitely. Babies often received rattles, and I find them fascinating as objects because besides being a sound-making object, right, for babies and toddlers, they could also be amulets and teething aids. They would usually be made of metal, though some could be made of wood or even bones. So most rattles would have a kind of handle and something that made sounds when it moved, right, such as loose pellets or small bells. But thinking specifically of children from wealthier families, the rattle could be made of silver and the teether part could be made of coral. Now, this is important because gum inflammation when a child was teething could be a big problem. And we know that infant mortality was very high at the time. And coral had long been used in medicine. It was associated with blood, with life, and it was believed to kind of harden the gums in children. So besides the medical side of it, of coral was also used as a protective charm. So people believe that it could protect them against illness, but also enchantment. And if we're thinking of rattles as amulets as well as toys and teething aids, I think that makes them even more interesting as objects. And going back to kind of the different functions of a rattle, sound was believed to ward off evil spirits, right? Of course, I don't mean that all Tudor parents were thinking that when they gave their child a rattle, but these beliefs, they were a part of this inherited medical and religious culture that layered meanings onto this very everyday kind of object, a rattle. And as you mentioned in The Merry Wives of Windsor, so Mistress Page says, "My little son and 3 or 4 more of their growth, so around the same age, will dress like urchins, oafs, and fairies, green and white, with rounds of wax and tapers on their heads and rattles in their hands. So there are so many portraits of babies and toddlers with rattles in their hands, and including the teether parts as well. And I think one of the most stunning of these portraits, and it's something that it's worth Googling, it's worth looking at the image, is a portrait by Paul van Zomer, and it's called Portrait of a Child with a Rattle. And it's a very luxurious example of one. But of course, most children would have a simpler version of that. The reason why I emphasize the fact that portraits are very interesting as a source is that it's so difficult to study early modern children. I think the world of children is so fascinating, regardless of what time period we're talking about, but there are so few sources available. So you have to combine kind of art history with archaeology, with contemporary sources, what people are saying, right? And so I think that's why it's interesting to combine all of these different entryways into this. But yeah, I think rattles are a great example of something that connects the worlds of playing, of medicine, of belief, and how these are all intertwined in the early modern period.
Speaking of visual depictions and making distinctions of the different kinds of toys that would have existed among different social strata for Shakespeare's lifetime, I want to ask about the specific of the dolls that you mentioned that children would be playing with. Were dolls specifically for girls in Shakespeare's lifetime, or were dolls a general sort of gender neutral toy for kids in this lifetime?
I think this is such an interesting question, because I think we sometimes forget how so many of the categories we use today and the way we think, how it was different in the past, how it's the same thing with the whole debate people were having about sort of pink for girls and blue for boys, and how that's something we know has changed through time. And I think dolls are a good example as well. Before talking about that, I just wanted, so that people can imagine them, just the dolls, besides the kind of sort of simple homemade dolls, rag dolls that we were talking about earlier, or even the sort of jointed dolls made of wood, which were interesting as well. There were imported dolls, and they were very popular in the sense that many people wanted to buy them, not in the sense that they were very accessible, because they could be expensive. But these dolls were called Bartholomew babies, because they were usually sold in London in St. Bartholomew's Fair. And they could be made of sort of painted wood or wax, and they were sometimes dressed in miniature versions of what adults wore. So they weren't usually baby dolls per se, but they represented older people. I'm just saying this because I think the name can be a bit misleading. And they weren't called dolls like we would until much later in the 18th century. Just before talking about gender, just for visual of it, I think a very interesting source again for this is portraits, right? So there's this 1577 painting of Arbella Stuart at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. And this is when she was a toddler, and she's holding one of these dolls, and you can see how intricate the costume is, how detailed everything is. And so this must have been a very expensive doll. Going back to your question, to finally answer your question about gender, whether boys played with dolls too, I learned quite a lot reading the work of a historian called Nicholas Orme and his research on Tudor children. So he writes that although there are fewer references about boys playing with dolls than girls, there are some. And we know that some dolls were male figures. So he writes that in this Latin dictionary from the 1580s, there's a sentence that goes, "Thy puppets bring with thee, if thou wilt play with me." So the reason why this is significant is that this was a book made to be used in a school classroom, a school for boys. So this kind of educational book, I think grammars, dictionaries, they often used examples from the boys' everyday life, and that include playing to teach them about languages and about grammar. The fact that the dolls appear in the book, therefore, could indicate that they were a part of the boys' lives as well, not just the girls. But of course, there are other clues that we have available. Going back to Hardwick Hall, there are household records, and they indicate the purchase of dolls for children, including a young boy, James Cavendish. So this confirms that dolls weren't exclusively associated with girls.
If you're enjoying learning about Tudor children's games and would like to go deeper to try out some of the games for yourself at home, I'd like to invite you to join us inside That Shakespeare Society. Members find not only paintings, primary documents, and museum materials that underpin our conversation into Tudor games, but we also have hands-on game tutorials that let you try out some of the games of the past. The ones that were popular for Shakespeare's lifetime, you can try right at home or in your classroom. Visit the episode page for today's show at CassidyCash.com/episode 413 and click Become a Member to explore all the insider extras just for That Shakespeare Society. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP413. We have referred to rattles here in this conversation, and I know on previous episodes of That Shakespeare Life, we've talked about hobby horses for children to play with, but Julia's research mentions other handheld toys, including what I found delightful. A windmill was one of the things that you shared in your work, Julia. Please tell us about this windmill and how it was made.
So I came across this windmill and the description in one of the best, I think, contemporary sources about this period, which is John Florio's dictionary, A World of Words. And so this was published in 1598, I think. And Florio described windmills as, and I'm going to read you the description because I thought it was so precise. A piece of card or paper cut like a cross and with a pin put in at the end of a stick, which running against the wind doth twirl about. So this is very similar to our toy windmills today. And of course, they were sometimes called paper mills because they were made of paper, but sometimes they were even called whirligigs, which I find delightful. I think that's such a cute, whimsical name for a toy.
I'm so glad that you shared that because I don't know if that's unique here to the South and the Southern United States where I'm from, but that's what we call those toys. And we still give them out for kids to play with. Yes, where they're on a stick and it's the folded paper held together with a pen. You can blow on it and it'll spin, or you can hold it in the wind and it will spin. And we call them whirligigs here, which I just thought was like a made-up term, but I'd love to think that it was a holdover from 16th century
brilliant.
England.
It must be, but that's incredible. I had no idea about that. I love how some words survive.
Yeah,
and it's
we brought over words to the new world as
definitely.
well.
Yeah. And yeah, I think this must be one of the best words in the English language. I think it's just so cute.
I agree with you. I think it's fabulous. It's definitely fun to say.
And it gives you the idea of movement and of fun and whimsy. And I think, it's a great name for a toy. So we know that these kind of windmills were incredibly popular in the Tudor period. And they appear in lots of contemporary accounts, sometimes made of thin wood or cloth, though usually made of paper. And the children would wave them around, right? Now, thinking specifically of Shakespeare, because of the podcast we're on, I think the most famous reference to a windmill from this period comes from The Winter's Tale again. There's a passage when Autolycus says, "I'll give thee thy money for thy sugar and take thy windmill in exchange." And I think this is telling because this hints at windmills being cheap and commonplace, and it links them to street vendors and fairs and popular culture. And I think it's always interesting, I think, when an object like this appears in one of Shakespeare's plays, because we know that these plays were meant for a wide audience, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why he's such a good and interesting entryway into the world of early modern England, because it gives you an idea. The plays indicate that most people would be familiar with these words, right? People are supposed to get it. And so it's a sign that windmills were everywhere, enough for people to understand the scene and what's happening. And going back to the historian I mentioned earlier, Nicholas Orme, he mentions windmills as well, even much earlier in the medieval period. And he describes them as sort of one of the simplest and most widespread, not to mention accessible, cheap toys that children could have, alongside with balls and tops and hoops, especially because these are all toys that are to be used outdoors, right? They're outdoor toys. You wouldn't have a windmill inside. I mean, what's the point, right? So I think they give you an idea of what kind of things children were doing when they were playing outside.
Well, speaking of outdoor games, or I guess let's maybe call them playground games, were there any kind of games that I think of tag or Ring Around the Rosie and things like this. Did children have these kinds of games for Shakespeare's lifetime? And if so, what kinds do we know about from the period?
Oh yeah, definitely. There were so many, some including balls and others kind of similar to tag. Yeah, there were plenty of physical outdoor games like that. And not only for children, right? Adults could play them as well. I think blind man's buff seems to have been very popular. You can find it everywhere. And even, I mean, when I was researching something completely unrelated, I was reading Reginald Scott's book on witchcraft, The Discovery of Witches from, I think it's 1584. And he mentions lots of children's games in a section of the book that is about tricks and deception. So he mentions jugglers and conjurers and people doing sleight of hand kind of tricks and things like that. And it's interesting because Scott was trying to show how some things that are mistaken for magic are just simple kind of manipulations of perception, right? And he uses blind man's buff as an example of that. And I think that's really telling. I love finding things in sort of unexpected sources like that. So yeah, so we know blind man's buff was very popular. But there were lots of other sort of physical playground games as well. And many of them would be familiar to us today. I mean, leapfrog for sure, prisoner's base or just base sometimes, running games of all sorts really. I think, again, going back to art, I think art is very helpful here. There's a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder called Children's Games. And it's just children having fun, right? So you get a glimpse of what this kind of play looked like. And I mean, of course, he wasn't based in Britain, but the painting gives you an idea of what children's games were like. And it's so interesting because I think I read somewhere that historians specializing in this subject, and especially in this painting, they were able to find like 80 or 90 different games that the children were playing depicted in this one painting, right?
It's a fascinating painting. I want to kind of visually explain this for if you've never seen it. It really is kind of a Where's Waldo sort of painting from the 16th century in the sense that it's very huge and there's all kinds of really small sized pictures of children engaged in various activities all over the painting. We will place a copy of this inside the research vault for That Shakespeare Society members. If you would like to see this one, you can go there as a companion to today's episode. We'll have this painting and several others packed in there, but it's definitely worth going and looking up this painting to see exactly the detail, because you really are able to step into the moment where kids are playing all kinds of Tudor games right around you. So it's a very, very fun painting for sure.
I think it's the kind of painting that you could just sit down and stare at for hours trying to decipher everything that is going on. And many of these games we don't know about, right? But yeah, I think it's so interesting. And going back to sort of the role that these games and activities played, I think it's important to remember that Tudor children and young people weren't just playing them for fun, right? I think the line between fun, games, sports, exercise, it's very blurry, right? Many of these activities could be considered healthy, and especially for elite, sort of wealthy boys, they were a key part of their education, especially if we're thinking of wrestling or archery or tennis. Thinking of ball games in general, I think besides tennis, stool ball was very popular. And this is something that took me a while to understand. I had to read quite a little bit about it because I'm originally Brazilian, so I didn't really grow up with cricket or baseball. But from what I could understand, this game, stool ball, is essentially a proto cricket or proto baseball, and so there's a bat and everything. And this is an interesting game because it was played by girls as well, sometimes by themselves and sometimes with boys. There are some of these games that were deemed kind of more acceptable for girls, and this stool ball is an example of that. And many of these games and activities and exercise like that, they are mentioned in books on how to educate boys. Especially there's one that I find really interesting, Sir Thomas Eliot's the book named The Governor, right? And this is a great source, I think, for learning about the life of boys in this period and what they were expected to learn. So yeah, so I think honestly, it's such a rabbit hole trying to understand all these games. And when I was making a video on this subject, I tried creating this database, and I was trying to organize the rules and how many people should play and when and where and how, because many of them are sort of seasonal. They're connected to festivals or specific religious festivities and things. And it became such a giant, crazy database that anyway, I lost track essentially of what I was doing.
Of trying to string everything
honestly
together. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, it's fascinating. They had lots to keep them busy, let's just say.
It's a really interesting perspective, the fact that that was written down in Sir Thomas Eliot's resource, because I mentioned I'm a mom of boys, and it's completely true that boys do learn better when their education is connected to physical activity. And I think that that's an interesting thought, that was there in the thought process of it's important that we include some of this physical education in their just strict book learning. That's a fascinating thought. Were there also board games or card games that were popular for children? What are a few of those that you think we should know about?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, especially for the colder months, right? Because I mean, all of these games, playing outside, all of that, that's very fun from April to October, but then during autumn and winter, you might be indoors. Thinking of board games, I think the most widespread must have been, seems like it, Nine Men's Morris. And it had been for centuries such a popular game. And I think one of the reasons for that was that boards could be scratched, right? You could make your own board into stone or wood. And if I remember correctly, I think Shakespeare mentions Nine Men's Morris in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But I could be mistaken. Am I right?
You are correct, yes.
Good, you're the expert. And I was interested to find that archaeologists found examples of these boards being etched sort of in churches, sort of steps or even seats. So you can see that maybe young people or adults, but maybe people were sort of getting bored during services and trying to keep themselves entertained. But yeah, so there's Nine Men's Morris, chess and checkers were very common as well, especially in more literate or affluent households. Those are easy to find in the sense that if the pieces and the board, if they were expensive, you can find them in house inventories, right? They could be quite valuable. Again, these were also played by adults, not just children. And that goes for backgammon as well. The same goes for cards, and we know that they were usually played by grown-ups, but they were increasingly popular with younger people in this period as well. And the reason why we know this is because there's a lot of writing by these moralists, many of them Puritan, who worried about the sort of corrupting effect that card games could have on the youth. And I think the main concern seems to be that with cards comes gambling, right? And we know that gambling and cards were very common at court, and Henry VIII was big on that, as we know. But thinking of why people would be concerned, I came across Cardinal Wolsey's household records. And I think they're a good example of this because they discouraged too much time spent on cards and games, and especially on gambling. I think, in Wolsey's case, he was thinking specifically of apprentices, right, and young servants. So people who basically, according to to Cardinal Wolsey, should just get on with their work, right? So I think there's this concern about not distracting young people from their duties, work, but also religious duties, right? I think that was a very important concern. Another clue that I found about this, about sort of people being worried about card games and gambling, comes from the London Guild ordinances. So their apprentices were being fined all the time in ale houses and other places for unlawful gaming. And that often includes dice and cards. So I think we have to remember, this is something we forget sometimes when thinking about this period, that there were many rules about how people could play and with whom and when. I think it's important to remember how playing for children and for young people was considered natural and healthy and expected, but it was also considered something that needed moral supervision, right? Play shouldn't get in the way of religious obligation or work. And again, I think another interesting source for this, one of the best for the 1530s, is Erasmus. So he wrote a lot about that in the Handbook on Good Manners for Children. And he argued that moderate play, quote unquote, was important for building character in children and young people, but it shouldn't be excessive. So games could be entertaining, but they were also about social training, right? Especially for the nobility. So if we think of things like archery and fencing, they reinforce the gender and class expectations of the time for boys. And I mean, we know Henry VIII again, who was known in his youth to be like quite the athlete and to love all kind of activities like that. It was something important, but at the time you should be mindful not to let it get too far.
Obviously, there is a bunch to unpack when it comes to games for children from this time period. And I wonder if you could share with us, from your extensive work into this topic, what are some resources you can recommend for us if we're new to the world of Tudor games and we want to explore further? Where should we begin?
Yeah, so you're right. This is a fascinating world, and it's definitely something that I'm still learning a lot about all the time. I would start with Nicholas Arm's work. I think it's very accessible. It's full of examples. I think he's a brilliant historian. Anthony Fletcher's book is really good as well. It's called Growing Up in England. It's very interesting. And I think, thinking of museums, there are so many great museums with collections that include items used by children, such as toys, and they are great. I mean, the Museum of London Docklands is truly brilliant, and they have lots of resources online as well. There's currently an exhibition going on mudlarking called Secrets of the Thames, and this is very interesting. There's also the Victoria and Albert Museum of Childhood, so the Young V&A, and they're incredible. They also have lots of resources online if you're not around London. And I would also recommend reading, I think it's such a good blog, the Museum of London Archaeology blog. And they often include posts on objects like toys. I mean, it is a big world to unpack, and there's a lot to explore, but I think these are some good resources to get started, I think.
These are fantastic suggestions. We will place links to these as well as to some books you can check out, along with more information on Julia Martin's work in the show notes for today, so you can go directly to those and explore all of these fascinating things about Tudor games and toys from Shakespeare's lifetime. So stay tuned for the URL on where to find those. Now, Julia, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
This is the hardest question so far, without a doubt. I guess if I had to pick just one besides the Bible and Shakespeare's works, which would keep me busy for a while, to be honest, I think I would go with Memoirs of Hadrian by Marguerite Yourcenar. So this is a novel published in the 50s, a historical novel about the life and death of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. And this is my mom's favorite book, and it's a book I reread every 3 to 4 years. This novel was one of the reasons why I fell in love with learning about history to begin with. And I have lost count of how many friends I've given a copy to. It's sort of my go-to recommendation in terms of a great historical novel. I mean, it's beautifully written. It's incredibly poetic and philosophical. It's deeply human. And whenever I read it, I can always find something new that I had missed before. And I always feel differently afterwards, after I finish it. So if I had to pick something to read over and over again, I think this would probably be my choice.
That's a beautiful selection. I love that that was your choice. You would be well set up on your deserted island.
Yes, I would be busy. I would have plenty.
You would. And it's so comforting too. I love that part about it. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on quite a few different projects, including making more YouTube and Patreon videos for my channel for Living History, plus the blog posts as well. And I'm always interested in sort of everyday life in the past. So everything from hygiene to toys, medicine, women's lives, and food. I'm also writing a piece on a 17th century French lady called Madame Fouquet, and she changed the way medicine was practiced in France and how poor people were cared for. She's a very, very interesting case study. Besides that, I also run a book club called My Body, My Book Club, and that keeps me busy as well. I mean, we sometimes read historical fiction, so that's a treat for me when sort of my worlds collide, the book club world and the sort of historian world. But yeah, so quite a lot going on in terms of writing, and as you know, it's the research, the writing, the recording, and the editing, and all of that. And yeah, it's a lot. But honestly, I love it. I love learning about history, and I love sharing what I learn even more. I think that's the best part. And I imagine that's your case as well, having a podcast.
It is a wonderful part of studying history. And I love following your blog and your podcast because you have such a passion for what you do. And you always bring out such fun things to learn about. So it's been a real treat for us getting to have you visit with us and help us explore the world of Tudor games and what they would have been like for children in Shakespeare's lifetime and where we can find mentions of them in Shakespeare's plays, which just helps us understand his works that much better. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Thank you so much for visiting with us today.
I really appreciate your invitation. I'm so glad to be here and to talk all things Shakespeare and toys and all else, because yeah, I just love listening to historical podcasts and learning about things like that. So it's a joy when I get to be a part of it. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you're very welcome. This has been fun. All of the resources we've mentioned today, including details on Julia Martin's work and links related to today's episode, are gathered for you in the episode page for today at CassidyCash.com/episode 413. And if today's conversation has piqued your interest, you can read Julia's entire blog and check out her YouTube channel called Living History, where she discusses Tudor children's games more in depth, along with even more Tudor history. Find direct links to all these things in the show notes for today. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 413. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.